The year is 1941, World War II is in full swing. In April, German troops entered the territory of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, which until then had united Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, and the country broke up. However, armed resistance immediately flared up in Serbia. Partisans operating in the mountains were so successful that they liberated part of the Serbian territory and created the so-called Republic of Užice, named after its center. It was run jointly by communist partisans and so-called Chetniks, which were resistance units loyal to the king. It was a strange connection forced by circumstances. In a normal situation, the two groups would be on completely opposite sides of the political spectrum. However, the contradictions grew stronger, and as a result the Germans occupied this republic during the November offensive. Partisans retreated to the mountains again, the Chetniks to the south, the communists to the east to Bosnia. And it is here, a few days before Christmas, that they will establish the first official proletarian brigade, which will become the cornerstone of their armed forces, which 3 years later will liberate all of Yugoslavia. It was created by an almost 50-year-old man named Josip Broz Tito, a man with an extremely interesting past and, as we know today, an even more interesting future. He was born in 1892 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in the small village of Kumrovec on the present-day Slovenian-Croatian border. Like some other chapters of his life, the exact date of his birth is unclear. Historians commonly cite May 7, but his birthday is officially celebrated on the 25th of May. Josip was born to Franj and Marie Broz. His father was Croatian, his mother Slovenian. He himself was the 7th of 15 children, but almost half of his siblings died shortly after birth or in early childhood. By the age of 21, when he joined the Austro-Hungarian army, he had worked in a number of mostly blue-collar jobs. He worked on a farm, as a locksmith, repaired bicycles, and was employed in factories. He rode through a large part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He worked in Zagreb, Ljubljana, Trieste, Munich, Mannheim and Vienna. He also worked for a time in Bohemia, in Chenkov and Pilsen. Shortly after he enlisted, the First World War began, and he thrived in the army.
According to a traditional legend, he was even supposed to be the youngest superintendent in the whole of Austria-Hungary.
He fights bravely, but he won't talk about it later because he finds the idea of fighting against the Austrian Emperor more useful than for him. In 1915, he is severely wounded by an enemy spear on the Russian front, spends more than a year in a Russian hospital, then becomes a prisoner of war. He spends the period up to 1920 alternately in prison camps and on the run, but is able to follow the Bolshevik Revolution closely. Its ideals appeal to him. He feels that communism gives a poor boy from a working-class background the best chance to make a name for himself. At the age of 28, he returns home and joins the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. The party is very strong at the time, but is outlawed after the assassination of the interior minister by a young communist. And so his wild ride continues. He climbs up the party ladder, but still has one foot in prison. He has to go into hiding, often traveling on false papers and changing his name. He chose the pseudonym Tito, the name under which he would become famous, simply because it was a very common name in the region of his childhood. In 1928, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for his communist activities. He serves all of this time, even spending more than 4 months in solitary confinement for planning an escape. After his release, he became a leader of the Communist Party, and in 1935 he met Stalin for the first time. He visits Moscow quite often, but in 1936, when Stalin launches his Great Purge, in which 1,000 people a day were executed on trumped-up charges, he tries to stay away from Moscow. Stalin has a large part of the Yugoslav leadership shot. Everyone is a suspect to him. Tito becomes General Secretary of the party, and in 1938 he is no longer able to avoid going to the Soviet Union. He is investigated but not arrested. No evidence has been found that he denounced anyone during the interrogations, but some historians say there was no way to escape Stalin's machine without it. Anyway, a number of other things played in his favor. His working-class origins or his disinterest in theoretical discussions about communism, but it is certain that this period influenced his relationship with Stalin. Now we go back to the beginning of our story, to the period of the Second World War. The Tito-led partisan resistance soon becomes the main force opposing the German occupation. The communists are more numerous than the king's loyal Chetniks, better organized and, like the Soviets, can think ahead. They are not just fighting against the Germans, but are systematically planning post-war domination of the country. Eventually their dominance is such that even King Peter II, from his London exile, recognizes them as the most important resistance group, as do the Western Allies, who begin to actively support them. In November 1944, Tito's partisans liberated Belgrade alongside the Red Army and Tito took power. It goes quickly. Within days the kingdom is formally abolished, and within a quarter of a year the Yugoslav Republic is established, not only reuniting but expanding the fragmented territory of pre-war Yugoslavia. Tito becomes Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, and retains the post of Commander-in-Chief. He begins to rule like a dictator. After all the atrocities that the nations of Yugoslavia committed against each other during the war, there is no other way. He has all Germans who lived in Yugoslavia before the war expelled and their property confiscated, and he goes after political opponents, especially the Chetniks loyal to the king, with whom he collaborated at the beginning of the war. Their commander-in-chief, Dragoljub Mihajlović, was chased through the Yugoslav mountains for 17 months before being captured and, to the horror of the West, executed. Over time, he will create a powerful police force to eliminate any even potential resistance against him. Tens of thousands of people are sent to labor camps where many perish. Yugoslavia had more political prisoners in the 50s than any other European socialist state except the Soviet Union. It would seem that such a policy could only be pursued by Tito in close association with the Soviet leader Stalin, but the opposite is true. Tito did an incredible thing. He got Yugoslavia out from under Moscow's influence. The fact that Yugoslavia had largely liberated itself made it a different situation than the other Eastern Bloc countries, and the strength of the domestic resistance allowed Tito to expel the Soviets from the country immediately after the war. He also rejected the establishment of joint ventures to move funds to Moscow and did not allow the Soviet Union to co-determine his country's foreign policy. Stalin watched it at first in amazement. He declared, "One nod and Tito would cease to exist." But later he will have to take him seriously. He will expel him from all communist organizations, and 1949 Yugoslavia will even be threatened with invasion by Soviet troops. But Tito weathered these difficult times, also thanks to the favorable international situation. Tito also survived Stalin's attempts at physical liquidation. The long indignant letters they exchanged, which Tito made public, are well known. In one of them Tito writes, "Stop sending people here to kill me. We've already caught 5 of them. One had a bomb, one had a rifle. If you don't stop this, I'll send one to Moscow, and you can be sure I won't have to send another." After Stalin's death, relations were mended. His successor Khrushchev came to Belgrade and apologized to Tito for the mistakes made by the previous Kremlin ruler. However, Yugoslavia's own concept of socialism, including elements of a market economy or the possibility of free travel, has been preserved. Tito, who had served since 1953 as president of Yugoslavia, strengthened his position in 1961 by founding the so-called non-aligned movement, with countries that did not join any of the Cold War blocs and were looking for a kind of middle ground. He became one of the few politicians of that time who were welcome guests both in the East and in the West. At home in Yugoslavia, Tito created a cult of personality around himself comparable to rulers like Stalin, Castro or Mao. His demeanor was effectively aristocratic, leading to speculation that his true origins must be different from those commonly reported. Tito, among other things, adopted the royal custom of becoming godfather to every ninth son born in a particular family. He even extended it to daughters. And indeed, in such a case, he would travel to remote villages with gifts for the family and the child. And just as his opponents, especially among the Yugoslav emigration, called him the Bloodhound, millions of people at home adored him. People even wore medallions with his portrait around their necks. Josip Broz Tito led Yugoslavia from the end of the war until 1980. He died after a long stay in hospital from complications arising from blood vessel congestion. He refused to have his leg amputated for a long time, and when he finally agreed, it was too late. Despite the fact that he was already 88 years old, it was a shock for many people in Yugoslavia, especially in his native Croatia. The last goodbye. Was at the time the largest state funeral ever held. 4 kings and 6 princes, 31 presidents, 22 prime ministers and 47 foreign ministers came to Belgrade. It was a big event for the whole world and the beginning of the post-Tito era for Yugoslavia. A man who had managed to hold together for 35 years a country burdened with as many contradictions and historical injustices as few others. A country that had just over 10 years left to exist.